Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukatali.
This morning we have with us in our studios Mr. George Cook, Research Associate at the Bandanarka Centre for International Studies, BCIS, who's here to talk with us about matters connected to the European Union. Good morning, George, and
good morning.
Welcome on the program.
Thank you so much, Faraz. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure having you, and especially from the BCIS.
Thank you.
Important institution. Mr. Cook, what is happening? People talk about the GSP Plus. As long as I can remember, this is being spoken about. And it's almost become a sort of a political tool in this country. And when pre-2015, when Mr. Wickremesinghe was giving various campaign speeches, he made it sound dead easy to get back. But perhaps we'll start by asking you how we came to lose GSP Plus. Did we lose it? Was it an expiry of some previous arrangement? Tell us.
That's a very interesting point that you make there for us, because when we look at GSP Plus and the actual three systems that they have within the European Union of the GSP Plus, and what they call everything but arms,
right,
in terms of a scheme, a system of monetary assistance that they give countries, which leads to duty-free as well as quota-free options for member states. I guess many are within the EBA category. But something that we need to understand is states of marginal interest, states of strategic interest. And this is the difference that sometimes we see the political falling into the economic aspects and their approach that they adopt there. And one thing that we have seen is when countries are of marginal interest, at that point the stakes are very high in terms of the conditions that have to be met. Whereas the conditions may be rather more fluid, or in terms of its implementation, to a much lesser degree of a serious nature when it comes to countries of strategic interest. So that's probably something that we saw in 2010.
So how did we sort of lose GSP Plus?
So there's a process of renewal within the system, and there's also a process of consultation that takes place within. It's known as the technical assessment process within the European Union, where all countries have got to come to a consensus in terms of a decision as to what kind of benefits they afford countries around the world. And we, having received the GSP, we wanted to move to the GSP Plus category. We were already in that, but of course, it's quite a tight market in there. It's quite a interesting field there, where our whole involvement with the European Union in terms of our political moves, domestic developments, all of this translates into tangible action on that end. And this is where they have been following, watching what exactly has been going on over here over that particular period, and that is where we saw a 5-year GSP Plus that we were enjoying at the point coming to a halt. But of course it was certainly very beneficial to us, especially when you look at it from the garment industry, or the ready-made garments, which were receiving a massive boost in terms of our exports into the European Union.
Is there a case for this, in that had our garment industry been far more professional and performing better in terms of quality and the finished and the end delivered product, whatever it may be, had it been that much higher, the standard, then do you think that the Sri Lankan, this cancellation may have been overridden by our professionalism, and we would be so much more in demand, whereas at the time then we said, well, we can go to Bangladesh, we can go anywhere.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because when you look at it, maybe a yes, maybe a no, but of course the garment industry has matched up to a lot of the conditions that have been set. Of course we are having now to look at more options in terms of higher wages, in terms of better working environments. These are all aspects that are being taken on board in the current context in terms of our renewal, or getting it once again, having it brought on board once more. But Of course, I come back to my main argument of strategic interest and marginal interest. And where did Sri Lanka fit in at that stage? Where did Sri Lanka fit in at that stage?
Yes. How much of this refusal to re-implement or to grant the GSP Plus facility, how much do you think that refusal was linked to the steadfastness of the Sri Lankan government then to, in essence, ignore or pay scant attention to the concerns of the European Union members in terms of a peaceful solution to the terrorist problem, whereas we were by then engaged in a full-on battle against the terrorists? What do you think?
When you look at it from an EU perspective, the European Union, well, 2 years later in 2012 received the Nobel Peace Prize, and that was very specifically for peace and reconciliation, democracy and human rights, and upholding these values within the European context. So obviously they are looking at reciprocating, taking this out into the world. But of course this whole one-size-fits-all does not actually translate into tangible benefits for all countries.
Yeah.
They don't always pursue the same path, they don't always pursue the same avenue of getting there.
Yeah.
For example, the European Union didn't. They themselves took a significant period of time.
Yes.
From, we look at the coal and steel pact to where they have come to today.
Yeah.
From the 40s. But of course, one thing that we've got to take on board always and be very mindful of is the fact that the European Union is looking at being a champion in these fields. They're looking at exporting a model. Once again, a question mark arises at that stage. But from a Sri Lankan perspective, there were dynamics at play over here, and some things that they would have accepted, they wouldn't have accepted. But of course, it is the main international conventions that we're supposed to comply with. There are about 27 of them, which are looking at, for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We're looking at the Convention Against Torture, the Convention for the Rights of the Child, all of which we are signatories to. And we are in the process of actively implementing within our
all
legal
of which
system.
we are signatories to, but have they all been ratified by our parliament?
Now, this is the process. I mean, once merely acceding to these international conventions, there's a massive process within, a domestic process at the national level, where we've got to amend regulations, we've got to make sure that we are in cohesion with what exactly is required internationally to maintain the international standard. And this takes time. This is not something that happens overnight. We can't expect that to be done overnight. So this is where the European Union needs to understand to a greater degree that countries like Sri Lanka, which are developing countries and which given what we have been through as well in terms of the conflict, in terms of where we have come to, it takes time. And one thing that we can do on our part is engage more actively with the European Union, which is something that they are looking for as well. This also gives us an opportunity, for example, the visit of the Prime Minister to Brussels that has just taken place. These are more opportunities for engagement, whether it was with the President of the European Commission, Juncker, or the Vice President, or even with the President of the European Parliament.
How much should we get, George? There was some announcement about some aid being given.
Absolutely. We're looking at, of course, in the long term. It's an amount that has been pledged up to 2020. And of course,
How
this
much
will
is
come.
that amount?
We're looking at something like 3.4 billion. So,
Rupees.
of course, it's going to come in. It's going to come in an installment basis. I mean,
This is
we're
about
not going to
200
get it-
million euros.
Exactly. Yes.
In the greater scheme of things, not a lot of money.
It is. We've also got to understand that we're not the only ones who would be knocking on their doors at this stage.
Right.
And we've also got to understand from their point of view. I mean, the European Union is going through a very interesting time right now. I guess we always say we live in interesting times, but the European Union certainly is facing many internal challenges. The actual remaining relevant, remaining together, all of this is being questioned. We have a wave of nationalism across Europe right now. So amidst all of these concerns that are coming up at that stage, it certainly is positive that we are being pledged something.
Yeah.
And it will certainly translate into more goodwill between the two. And that is exactly what we want to a much greater degree across the world.
A couple of questions coming in through from our viewers. One is asking you, is there any other country that lost the GSP Plus facility in recent times like Sri Lanka did?
When we look at the three categories once again, in that particular period, no. But of course, we have countries which have moved up the ladder, which have moved into better categories. For example, Pakistan is, as of the beginning of this year, I do believe, was one of the few countries from our region which was actually in the GSP Plus, on the GSP Plus level. We've had countries like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, all of them within the EBA category. And at the same time, we have countries like ourselves and Vietnam who are in the GSP category. So, I mean, it's a gradual process, it's a gradual progression, but of course it also depends on economic developments within the country.
And George, we have another question. Viewers asking, well, what about Pakistan? Pakistan got the GSP Plus facility before Sri Lanka, apparently, according to what viewer is saying. And their record on various matters, terrorism is still rather robust over there. And there's absolutely no comparison in terms of that aspect and Sri Lanka. So viewers asking, how come?
I come back to my initial argument of countries of marginal interest and strategic interest.
Right, so that one's this. What is Pakistan is obviously strategic interest.
Absolutely.
So in Sri Lanka, little Sri Lanka is a marginal interest.
The European Union is very important to us.
Yeah.
As to whether it is mutual is the question.
Is it really important, or is it something that our Prime Minister, with his long-standing friendship with members of the European Union, is it a personal thing? No. Is that really some national interest?
It is of absolute national interest that we engage very closely with the European Union.
Right.
The European Union consists of 500 odd million inhabitants. It's an extremely small region of the world, but of course a very powerful region. A region which, from which NATO originates, a region from which we've seen models of regionalism, a region from which we've seen control of the world in terms of strategy, emanating from the European Union, or the countries in the European Union. So this certainly is very important for us. Whether it's the EU, whatever the country may be, the greater engagement, the better. And this is something that we need.
What do you think the EU sees now that they were unable to see for 9 years after up to 9 years after the war ended? What will they change their glasses? What?
One thing that we are noticing is in terms of policy, in terms of programs, the whole concepts of good governance, policy planning, environmental regulations and abiding by them, the whole thing of justice, free, fair play, these relate very well with European Union standards, and that is exactly what they're looking at from the human rights perspective.
We're talking about justice. What do you think would have happened to the governor of the European Bank, the central bank in Europe, whatever it's called, or any central bank in Europe? What do you think would have happened to the governor of that particular institution under European law, talking about justice and so on, if they had engaged in sort of questionable transactions, or transactions that give rise to question marks, like I'm sure you know, you must have read and heard, that has been happening in Sri Lanka?
One thing that we see in the European Union is the consultation process that takes place amongst the member states. Everyone has to come on board. It's the whole process of building consensus, and no decision is taken. And as a result, it becomes a very transparent, and the regulatory process becomes that much more easier for them. Of course, I say easier for one reason, but of course it's a very difficult thing to achieve a consensus amongst all the countries. But I mean, they have a very stringent framework in place which they are trying to follow.
Yeah.
They have very strict policies in place because of the fact that all countries have pledged money into the European Union. Everybody is concerned about what they have put into it, and they certainly want to see something positive coming out of it at the end of the day.
A viewer is saying that George is not answering your question. Ask him again. So I'm going to ask you again. What do you think would have happened to a governor of a particular central bank in in Europe, within the EU? In terms of justice, what do you think would have happened?
There would have been there is a very strict policy with it,
Right.
in terms of ensuring transparency within the system. And
And if that transparency for some reason got clouded?
it wouldn't, because of the fact that the framework is so stringent,
Right.
that it would certainly weed out, or it would certainly make changes to, as per the requirement at the time.
Right. Is Sri Lanka being used for its geopolitical position to the detriment of Sri Lanka?
Certainly, Sri Lanka's geopolitical position is of extreme significance. It translates into both a blessing as well as sometimes a blessing. It's not exactly a blessing sometimes, let's put it that way. But of course, one thing that we understand is the island has not moved anywhere before or after an election. The island remains exactly where it is. Of course, once again, they look at it from a policy orientation, from a personality point of view, which is what translates into action over there. Because when we look at where Sri Lanka is based, we talk about it being a gateway between the east and the west. We talk about it being a transit point. Irrespective of what definition you want to use there, something that we always see is countries needing to ensure strategic interest first. And we should look at it from the same perspective from our angle. It should be of strategic interest to us as well. Whether it is the European Union, whatever the countries that we may be dealing with in the European Union or across the world, we have got to always ensure that it is a pro-Sri Lanka stance that we have adopted.
When you are going about your work in the BCIS and so on, and you read in the press and you hear on the radio and you see on TV the various sort of scams, deals, that kind of, where proper procedure has been ignored, either by design, by omission, whatever. Do you sort of look at it and say, oh my God, how are we going to explain this to the international community? Does it impact on your work?
Well, at the BCIS we look at a lot of research. We're engaged in a lot of research of what exactly goes on. And something that you've got to sometimes accept are conditions on the ground.
What do? Do you take those things and place it under the tab that says emerging nation, third world nation, it's to be expected, and you just stick it in that?
Absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not, because it's a continuous evolution process within. Every country is going through this process. Every country has a path to progress along.
Do you think the European Union members are worried, or do they sit down and take note of the disparity in the distribution of wealth in a country like ours? We have it's across the board actually, so it's not only limited to the bond market and so on. That's a different disparity. But do you think they take notice of this disparity in the distribution of wealth and resources in this country?
That wouldn't be a part of the debate, for the mere reason that such internal aspects are found in every country around the world. I mean, it comes to disparities in economic positioning or wealth amongst citizens of a country. But one thing that they look at is a country's implementation process, agreement with international conventions according to EU standards, whether it meets up to the EU opinion, whether it matches up to the EU requirements. And this is something that countries need to take into mind, and that is something that we look at as well from a Sri Lankan perspective.
Another viewer is asking me, George, you're having some remarkable influence this morning. One of them says, why don't you get into politics?
I prefer the educational research aspect of life and continuing on those lines.
Don't you think if you got into politics you'd make a material difference? You can explain things to people.
You certainly can
your
make
other 224 colleagues as it stands now?
You certainly can make a difference and an impact from within the field of research, within the field of education, because one thing you're doing and one thing we do through the BCIS is also reach out to students from the international relations perspective, but we also look under the umbrella of international studies. And I'm on a secondment at the BCIS and looking at issues of foreign policy, looking at issues of international relations, looking at much larger related fields as well. And that certainly is very rewarding in the long term.
I don't think I can ask you this question. Somebody's asking, I think it's too personal. They're asking you, who gave you the opportunity to serve in Europe with the EU? Did you serve in the European Union?
I have served in an embassy in the European Union,
Right.
the Sri Lankan embassy.
Okay. How did you get that job?
Because it's part of the foreign service.
Oh, I see. So, I see. All right. So there you get sort of posted to various places. Excellent. Is it so you're on secondment to the BCIS? Yes. Does it affect your seniority or
No,
anything like
it
that?
doesn't.
It carries on.
It's within the Public Service Commission regulations.
In an ideal world, where would you like to serve?
Anywhere actually, because serving out there for Sri Lanka certainly gives you so much of scope, so much of opportunity of representing the country, flying the flag out there, and that is something that has always resonated very closely with me.
Where's the tough posting in terms of anti-Sri Lanka sentiment?
Well, at the time Europe was
Yeah.
anti-Sri Lankan, at the time I was serving in Europe.
What about Canada now?
All countries, I mean, irrespective of the country, and I think when it comes to engagement, certainly Canada and Prime Minister Trudeau and his policies
Yeah.
resonate very closely with what we should be doing and where we should be going in terms of inclusion and the actual understanding of everybody coming on board. But wherever it is, wherever we are representing Sri Lanka, one thing that relates is the tougher the position, the better the job, because you're able to do something tangible at the end of the day.
One more question from this viewer who says, how did our political leaders assure a return of GSP Plus imminently when there is obviously so much more to be done?
It's a step-by-step process. It's not going to happen overnight, and this is something that...
Do you think some of these politicians realize that?
They do. They
Right.
certainly do, and of course, we're not going to be able to snap our fingers and say we want it from tomorrow, and they're not going to do that. So this continuous engagement with the European Union translates very well into aiding that process, pushing it along, and that is what we're seeing happening. I do believe we're going to be engaging much closer with the European Union countries, with all countries, and this is not just at the center in Brussels, but something that we need to see is reaching out to all 20-odd countries in the European Union, where we then have an opportunity of greater engagement. I mean, when we talk about diplomacy, Cardinal Richelieu's comment comes to mind where he talked about continuous engagement for a durable relationship rather than something which is looked at in from a more opportunistic perspective.
Yeah. Somebody else is asking. Somebody says it's a waste of talent having George Cook at the BCIS. So this is one of your fans, obviously.
It certainly isn't a way. It's an absolutely rewarding experience to be able to engage in research. This is something that I find personally fulfilling, something that is in keeping with the requirements, because lots of times we get caught up in the day-to-day running of issues or tackling of issues. We're not looking at in-depth analysis of what has been in order to understand what will be and what is actually. And this is where we need to see greater study of the past and the present in order to understand the linkage between the two, avoid the pitfalls of what we have gone through, and look to the future in a way in which we are going to be able to achieve so much more. And that is something we can do.
Thank you for that answer. These questions aren't going away, George. Oh, right, here goes. This is obviously your fan club's watching the program. He should be posted to a grade A mission or MC forthwith. Shall we send a recording of this to the foreign minister? How is your relationship with the foreign minister then? Robust, I suppose. You don't have to answer that, you know that.
Well, the foreign minister is the foreign minister. I am but a part of ministry in that sense of it. But of course, I have been on a period of leave at the University of Colombo.
Right.
Before I got my secondment to the BCIS. I was with the ministry for a few months. But of course, it's part and parcel of my doctoral studies which are going on right now.
And you're following the American elections?
Yes.
What do you think? Do you think we should introduce this presidential debate system in this country?
It certainly is a very good opportunity for us to assess candidates at that stage, where you have them pairing off with each other in terms of their resolve, in terms of their patience, in terms of their understanding and comprehension of issues. All of this comes out in a presidential debate, and that is something that we're seeing in the US, and we've seen in the US continuously.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.